Many authors compare him to Plato, Aristotle, some of the Western philosophers. Which group of people wrote the first novels? Chinese. They couldn't write them until what? Have to have a printing press. Who were the first known inhabitants of Japan? The Jomon. First people we know anything about who lived in Japan. Now, do learn the names of those 4 big Japanese islands. Any of you who are interested in Japan might wind up going there. In fact, both of my daughters are interested, and they've started learning Japanese. So one of them actually applied for a teaching position in Japan one time, less than a year ago, really, but was turned down. The other one still studying Japanese. All right, the Japanese mounted horseman was known as the samurai. And you run into this name from time to time, folks. What does Shintoism teach, among other things? What does it teach?
Cleanliness.
Cleanliness.
Emperor is divine.
Emperor is divine. That's one of the main things. That's got him. Emperor was divine.
Yeah, obedience to authority.
Obedience to authority.
Natural beauty.
Natural beauty. And they often surround their homes and gardens with flowers. One thing I want to say about the Japanese, they fought to the death during World War II, and they fought and fought hard and would not quit, but they finally quit when their emperor told them to stop fighting. And when their emperor said to stop fighting, there's a story that General Wainwright, who had been captured in the Philippines in the beginning of World War II, he was on this island. He and his men had not even so much as a knife. But when General Wainwright heard that the Japanese emperor had told his people to quit fighting, he walked right to the commander of the island and said, from now on, I'm taking charge of this island. And the Japanese, even though they had all the guns, all the ammunition, they gave it to them. I mean, after all, why not? Their government was no longer going to support them, so they just simply, it was their mindset. When their emperor said we quit fighting, they quit. I talked to a serviceman one time who attended the surrender ceremony, and they were kind of terrified that the Japanese were going to pretend to surrender and all of a sudden start fighting, but they didn't. Again, why not? Their emperor had said, everybody stop fighting, the war is over. And from the generals to the privates, all at once, all of a sudden, they all simply stopped fighting. Their mindset. Now, the enemy we're fighting now, folk, as far as we know, there is no such leader unless one would suddenly appear. If the 12th imam would appear up and say, stop fighting, maybe they do it. But at the moment, there is no such leader. But in the case of the Japanese, when their emperor said stop, they all stopped. All right. One thing, again, that these islands all had in common was the civil service exam. I mean, not just islands, but one thing that these people had was a civil service exam. It was found in, again, in China, Korea, Japan, and in Vietnam. Vietnam was unique in that they allowed every male to take it. Women were not allowed to. Women were more elevated in Vietnam than they were in these other places, and probably the society that kept the women down the most was China. I mentioned two things about Chinese women. Number one was the practice of foot binding that was designed, among other things, to keep women under subjection, as well as to make them look more attractive to men. And number two was that in hard times, female babies were killed. Female young girls were killed because they were looked on as being less useful to society than the males.
Okay, but in Vietnam, you said that the women could take that civil service test.
Did I say that? I did say that women sometimes led rebellions against the Chinese. Did I say that women could take the exam?
You said any male could.
You said the poor.
What I said was any male could.
Oh,
Any male could take the exam. They did not have social classes.
okay.
They did not. Well, they might have had some people who were a little bit richer, but they did not have a super powerful rich or an established nobility, what you call a landed gentry. Vietnam, the Vietnamese mindset has simply not lended itself to that. Their people were more equal than they were in a lot of other societies. What disease does your book mention that came through and decimated a lot of this part of the world? We don't even know where it started from, but smallpox. Persons who lived around cattle tended to not have as much smallpox, but they had some. Yeah, Vietnam has some cattle, as does Japan and Korea. I haven't heard of the Chinese. I don't know if they're very much cattle raising or not, but there are cattle to be found in Japan and in Vietnam.
You have to know like the Heian period, the Nara period.
No, I told you, don't worry about those periods. No, I overlooked them. Japan sits on the top of what?
Or
Volcanic islands, and they're also located on a fault line. And from time to time, you'll hear of them having some severe earthquakes. One struck in 1923, and your second semester book shows a picture of it. Honestly, when I first looked at the picture, I thought it was the bombing of Hiroshima. It looked like, I mean, the city of Tokyo was leveled. Worse, perhaps, than World War II leveled it. Then the Japanese, though, are great at being resilient. They take their licks and they come back. And they've done this time and time throughout history. Again, I can't think of anything that was invented by the Japanese, someone who knows more Japan history than I might can, but they are excellent copiers. And they have been throughout much of their history. They've copied from China, and especially in recent times, they've copied from the United States and from Europe. And they can do a better job sometimes than either one can at making the things they copy. Oh yes, on the civil service exam in China, they went through a period of time where to do well on it, you had to know what? What was this? What is civil service? Confucianism. You had, in some cases, memorize and write down large portions of Confucius' sayings. Confucianism. Oh yeah, the Grand Canal joins what two rivers? The Yellow River and the Yangtze River. All right. When the Muslims came in, they might have conquered India, other than the fact that the Indians changed warfare. What slowed the Muslim advance down?
Jungles.
The who?
Jungles.
Other than the terrain, other than the jungles, what slowed the Muslims? What, so somebody else. Who slowed them down? The Mongolians. I mean, I've mentioned that. See, they were making some headway. Of course, the people of India the soldiers began to fight from horseback. But ultimately, what stopped the advance of Islam more than anything else was the Mongolians came down, and Islam had to turn its attention to defending itself against these Mongolians. And the people of India then got some relief. As far as I know, the Mongolians never really went into India so much. Instead, they invaded this territory right in here. These mountains are really, really rugged. That would even make the Mongolians pause. But the Mongolians came through here, and they did a lot to stop the Muslim advance into India. Eventually, a group of people came into India, and they were a threat to both the Muslims and the Hindus. Who were these people?
The Buddhists?
Not the Buddhists, but a group of people came from an unexpected source, really.
Okay, what was the question?
The question is, what group of people eventually came to India that eventually conquered India, in fact?
British?
The who?
British?
The British. Well, yeah, the British. The first Europeans to arrive, though, were who? Portuguese. The first Europeans to arrive, the Portuguese. Portugal lacked the means to conquer India, but they were followed by the British, and the British eventually conquered both India and Pakistan and kept the Indian people and Pakistanis from fighting each other for a time. But the British came in, they conquered India, and I must mention, of course, that the British came in to save face after they lost 13 North American colonies. Hopefully all of you know that story, have some familiarity with that story. The British had 13 colonies in North America that rebelled. The colonists won, and one of the colonies was Georgia. I mean, I'm not going to ask for show of hands, but hopefully all of you have heard that story, at least some of it. And then the British, to save face, they went and conquered India. Who taught the world how to grow cotton? Who? Chinese. Chinese introduced cotton to us. All right.
Are we gonna have to know what the Silk Road was?
Yeah, by all means. Your book emphasizes that. I mean, I did not pay much. I was dimly aware there was a Silk Road, but of course, this is a true world history class, where we actually teach history. Well, in my day, all they taught was Western civilization. And I have to admit, I knew little about Vietnamese and Chinese and Japanese history or Indian history. But so the Silk Road seems to have been really important because it was the means by which Buddhism went into China. Of course, smallpox also went into China. And Buddhism was introduced to Korea, thanks in large part. And also, the gold in Europe found its way to China, and folk, it might ought to shake you up a little bit. The wealth of the United States right now is finding its way into China. At one time, the United States owed its own citizens. Every time you buy a bond, you know, you would be loaning your government money. But the Chinese bought up a lot of the United States debt, and I think most of you know that. Basically, folk, China owns us. Just like China got the gold from the Roman times. And if you go to China today, you'll still find some Roman coins, gold coins. The Chinese still spend them, still circulate them, still hoard them, still collect them. They're still there, lots of them. And it impoverished Europe for a time, until Europeans got gold from the New World, and gold was discovered in Africa, and Europeans got gold. Of course, Europeans also began to print paper money after a time. But they got their gold from the New World. Anyway, China, folk, there's a rumor that China is buying up the world's gold and hoarding it. I can't verify it. I don't know who can do it, but this story is being told. Some of you might have heard it. All right. I think that about covers everything. some of the questions again will be true, false. A is true and B is false. Know the basics, and I'll see you on Wednesday.